Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the State Library of Queensland. First of all, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather here tonight and pay respects to the ancestors who came before them. This particular part of Brisbane River was a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, a place where community would come to listen, learn and share. Tonight we're honoured that one of Australia's most revered and acknowledged Aboriginal leaders and academics is here with us to share her stories, her experiences and her visions for tomorrow. We are very excited to have Professor Marcia Langton here to talk with us this evening. You should also be aware that we are recording tonight's lecture and also the question time. So if you have any concerns about that, please let the people who will be coming around with the microphones know, and we can accommodate that in some way. And the last thing to let you know is tonight's event will last for approximately an hour, and that will include some question time at the end. So we'll look forward to that period of the night. SLQ is particularly proud to have a partnership with Griffith Review, and this is to deliver public programs here in the State Library of Queensland. The two organisations have a great and wonderful synergy, which is about fostering public debate and also about delivering thought-provoking programs. And we hope tonight that this particular program fits the bill for that. Griffith Review is a quarterly publication which provides a bridge between the expertise of specialists and the curiosity of readers. Essays in it reflect on the underlying significance of events and trends. They explain the details that get lost in the news and the regular media, and they examine the unintended consequences of public policy. Each issue, if you don't know it, is devoted to a particular topic or theme and includes a range of essays, analysis, fiction, poetry, photography, art. And if you don't subscribe to it yet, you will, I'm sure, after tonight. It's a magnificent publication and we are very proud to be part of it. It's my duty tonight really to just welcome you all, but also to introduce to you Julianne Schultz. Professor Julianne Schultz is the founding editor of the Griffith Review, and we're very pleased to have her personally here with us tonight to introduce Marcia Langton.
Thank you, Jill. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Jill said, we've done a number of events in the past with the State Library, and we very much value this collaboration. We find it's a very useful way of providing the writers who write major essays in each quarterly issue of Griffith Review with another opportunity to advance and develop their thinking and to get feedback from audiences in these sorts of forums. So we're very grateful to be able to do this and look forward to future events as well. Tonight it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Marcia Langton to speak to you based on her essay in the current issue of Griffith Review. This issue is called Reimagining Australia, and it's not a political wish list. It's not something which is saying to the new government, this is what you should do. Rather, it's sketching out the sort of territory of what it is, what it means to be Australian today, and what are some of the issues that we confront and how they might be addressed. When I spoke to Marcia about maybe writing for this issue, she was very, very keen to do so, and wrote what I think is a very brave piece, writing in a very clear and direct fashion about the very pressing and urgent matters in Indigenous relations, especially in remote communities today. Her essay is called Trapped in the Aboriginal Reality Show, and I think for many people who've been involved in Indigenous relations for a long time, or Aboriginal people themselves, that's what the reality has felt like. It's very much been about feeling at times like it's a reality TV show and there's no escape. Marcia, as many of you, or as most of you will know, is a very eminent professor in Indigenous relations in Australia. She's had many years working as an anthropologist all around this country. She is currently the Foundation Professor of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. So I would, with that brief introduction, I'd like to introduce her. Thank you.
Thank you. I acknowledge the ancestors of the traditional owners. I acknowledge the traditional owners and wish them well in their endeavours. As a descendant of the Yiman of the Upper Dawson River Valley in central Queensland and a sometimes resident of Queensland, it is wonderful to speak here as a guest of the Queensland State Library. I thank Jill Eddington and the redoubtable editor of Griffith Review, Julianne Schultz, and her colleagues. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous staff of the State Library, whom I met with this morning. They do a wonderful job, and I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow Yiman cousin Alan Parsons and his good friend Willie Prince. And Alan and Willie are setting up an Indigenous disabled people's network and doing an almighty job. I want to briefly address myself here at the State Library of Queensland tonight to a difficult subject and begin a conversation with you in the hope that we can do our work in this time of opportunity with greater clarity and achieve better outcomes. In the weeks following the publication of my Griffith Review essay, Trapped in the Aboriginal Reality Show, young women, mothers, grandmothers and those who work with them approached me and supported my frankness. "You spoke for me," one woman wrote. Another said, "You and I know that the problem is big bunga politics. If I have to translate this for you, you haven't been in the Aboriginal world in the last 30 years. So many women and girls have been assaulted, raped and abused for so long, the big bunga way has become normalised, and assault, rape and an astonishing variety of forms of other abuse have become normative. Vertical violence involves responses, usually but not always, dysfunctional. Attacks on police officers and police stations, for instance. These have been reported at Arakoon and Wadday and other places, with the usual result that police officers are evacuated for periods of time and the gangs take over these townships, exacerbating the lawlessness, anarchy, crime and lateral violence against their own. Other victims of vertical violence in Aboriginal areas include nurses and teachers, and of course we've just seen another incident in the Torres Strait Islands. In brief, the idea is that the subjects of colonial and post-colonial governmental relations and other relations involving the exercise of power, both in institutional and generalised social arrangements, express their dissatisfaction and anger with their circumstances through acts of violence against the immediate class of institutional supervisors, such as police, nurses and teachers. The consequences of this vicious, repetitive type of violence on officers and professionals in the policing, health and education fields are high. The big bunga politic lies at the heart of both lateral and more frequent forms of vertical violence that we see in or are reported from Aboriginal Australia much too regularly. It is painful and difficult to explain, but this is what I hope to do here. Not only does this very useful expression, big bunga politics, capture the endemic pattern of lateral and increasingly vertical violence that plagues family and community life, but also it encapsulates neatly the dysfunctional response of mainstream Australian political institutions to the accelerating crisis in the Aboriginal world of the last 30 years. Many of us remember the big bunga politics that brought the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, or ATSIC, into disrepute and finally led to its disestablishment. Throughout the life of that body, Aboriginal men and women who were, without doubt, leaders in their communities became embroiled in a political theatre led by big men who failed to show leadership on the most pressing issues in those communities: housing, health and education. When I was the chair of the National Indigenous Working Group on Native Title, following John Howard's 10-point plan of native title extinguishment, I would schedule the difficult agenda items for times in the afternoon when I knew that troublesome ATSIC commissioners would be at the TAB placing bets on horse races. These were the kinds of tactics that we women in Aboriginal affairs have used to overcome the big boonga politics, and we have done so to ensure positive outcomes and to avoid being bullied into enforced compromises and silences. One of the most important developments I have observed recently is the way that leaders in Cape York have dealt with the problem of child neglect. You will know that the Family Responsibilities Commission has been tabled in the Queensland Parliament in the last month. It was my honour to chair a meeting of Cape York community leaders last year discussing ways for families and communities to ensure that children are not neglected or abused. The idea of commissions in each community made up of Aboriginal elders and community people, along with retired judges and others with expertise, was developed by the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership. These commissions will consider the cases of children at risk in their own community and design a response that involves the family group and the community in ensuring safety and care for each of the children. This essential work will now be backed up by legislation. And it is why I want to talk about a particular type of violence here this evening. Lateral violence is the expression of anomie and rage against those who are similarly victims of vertical violence and power relations, usually family members, and in the main, the most vulnerable, old people, women and children, but especially the children. I have been reading about this problem of lateral violence and discovered that other Indigenous people in North America and elsewhere have recognised the harm being done in their communities because of this type of violence. The contribution of lateral violence to levels of mental illness is just one of the many detrimental impacts. Nurses have also recognised this form of violence, and it has been identified as a key issue in their workplace health discussions. I read the following by Canadian psychologist Lloyd Robertson and recognised the importance of acknowledging this harmful behaviour. Lateral violence has impacted Indigenous peoples throughout the world to the point where we harm each other in our communities and workplaces on a daily basis. Mohawk Rod Jeffries told a gathering in La Ronge last December. That violence includes gossip, shaming of others, blaming, backstabbing, family feuds, and attempts at socially isolating others. According to Jeffries, this form of violence occurs when, out of anger and frustration, an oppressed group turns on itself and begins to violate each other. Lack of trust, favouritism and highly defensive people have resulted in poor services, rigid and arbitrary enforcement of rules and a lack of healthy communication. Community spirit has suffered and people have largely stopped volunteering to help their communities become healthy. We have learned to oppress each other. By defining actions such as malicious gossip as violence, we can better appreciate that this kind of mental assault can be just as damaging as physical violence. We can appreciate the trauma these attacks can have on others, and we can better understand how these attacks undermine both our communities and our own well-being. We can challenge gossip, attempts to shame others, backstabbing and other forms of lateral violence by pointing out how such actions undermine the balance, vision, trust and empowerment that we want in all our communities. Other literature on lateral violence from Canada raises issues that are remarkably similar. There are lessons to be learnt and implemented in Australia, for example, with regard to suicide rates. The conceptual framework for discussing these problems in Canada is sophisticated and therapeutic. For instance, in another report I read the following. Other authors from British Columbia present a theoretical explanation of suicide. The central idea in their article is that people who undergo radical personal and cultural change are at higher risk of suicide. The data show that there is substantial variation in suicide rates across the 196 bands in the province, and that the differences might be explained by cultural continuity. There is a strong correlation between communities that have made an active and collective effort to engage in community practices which preserve and develop cultural continuity and low youth suicide rates. Specifically, it is argued that particular cultural factors may help to strengthen or re-establish a healthy cultural continuity. Markers of cultural continuity are land claims, self-government, education services, police and fire services, health services and cultural facilities. I want to draw attention to the qualification made in this quote about developing cultural continuity. The authors use the expression, and I emphasise it, healthy cultural continuity. The authors tackled problems that we too must acknowledge and bring into the policy debate. For instance, isolation of community members from the outside world is a serious problem. Too many young people conclude that the only place they can live is on the reserve. Most First Nations people appear to consider their lives normal because of their lack of exposure to life in other families and places and their general lack of education. And another point, the community is split in two, those who are politically connected and those who are not. The major difference is reflected in access to resources and opportunities, a difference that extends to the lives of children at school. Families of the first group enjoy preferences for work and other payoffs. There is no equity, democracy or valuing of education and training. In the present climate of goodwill and enthusiasm for tackling these difficult problems, it is incumbent on us to readjust the policy settings and ensure that there is an end to the big bunga politics, the political and theatrical use of lateral violence in Aboriginal politics, and a resurgence of good values for family and community living. This must start with those people who reject the standover men and women who have benefited so much from the misery of our people. It also means engaging in policy development in a sophisticated way to enable us to measure change and evaluate our successes and failures. It also means that non-Aboriginal people need to be better informed and engage in a rational debate with us and overcome their romantic preference for the big bunga Aboriginal political representatives. The black woman in the plain dress with the soft voice will usually be far harder working and more effective. But then, many of the people working in the Aboriginal industry are not seeking alliances with ordinary, hard-working, effective people. That is what I have observed. Developing institutions and opportunities for Aboriginal citizens will mean the end of the old protectionist and assimilationist thinking, much of which had little to do with human development and everything to do with incarceration and humiliation. Land titles, permit systems, Aboriginal non-government organisations all will require rethinking and rebuilding in order to allow Aboriginal social and economic development. It is crucially important for the future of the children to cast a cold, objective eye over Aboriginal society. With Howard and his class of haters on the sidelines, it will be possible to do so. It need not be the case that every aspect of Aboriginal tradition is defended as worth retaining in a Manichaean struggle with racist ideology. Rather, we should be able to rationally and calmly consider the potential benefits that might flow from shortening the funeral sorry camp periods of confinement or limiting the impact of traditions such as house cursing. We cannot afford to ignore the much weakened hold of cultural values and norms of social behaviour and the descent into anarchy and lawlessness in many Aboriginal communities from time to time. Appeals to Aboriginal culture are unable to prevent this, without denying that there are many aspects of Aboriginal culture that are crucial to the maintenance of healthy norms, such as the kinship system and the bond it creates. The fundamental problem with the appeal to recognise Aboriginal culture, when this is used to deflect attention away from lawlessness and criminality, or sadly, as a kind of displacement activity that serves to uphold a fragile identity, is that the evidence has been mounting for 3 decades that even the most stalwart upholders of Aboriginal laws feel powerless to deal with the new plagues of alcohol and drug abuse. Moreover, even senior Aboriginal people who cling to a largely imaginary past find some solace in the belief that Aboriginal society was peaceful. Common sense should tell us that this was not the case. How could Aboriginal tribes hold out for so long against the marauding settler enemies, if not with extreme violence? The sexual abuse and assaults in Aboriginal communities and the general violence are the result not simply of the traditions of violence in Aboriginal society, but more to the point, of the terrible violence inflicted on Aboriginal people by colonial officers, police, missionaries and the general citizenry in a long orgy of race hate. The result is not an uprising of angry Aboriginal people against their oppressors, but lateral violence, violence committed against our own. This is why children suffer so much. They cannot escape the bursts of fury and rage that erupt on a nightly basis. They cannot escape. This is the most insidious aspect of this lateral violence. The right-wing warriors use the term rescued generations, not stolen generations. because they cannot countenance Aboriginal family and community life as places of love, where strength and good values are nurtured. They cannot countenance this simply because of their fundamentally racist views of our society. If we do not acknowledge the faults in our own society, we give succour to those racists. If we do not acknowledge them frankly, if we do acknowledge them frankly, we can overcome just plain stupid racism by going forward with workable solutions. In the 1990s, Noel Pearson came to a view of the hysterical and baseless right-wing politic that, following B.A. Santa Maria, held that Aborigines constitute the enemy within and their demands a left-wing agenda that would cause damage to Australian society. Ghassan Haj has labelled this political tirade paranoid nationalism. Noel retired from the public face of native title and reconciliation arguments and engaged with the right in an effort to point out to the handful of rational thinkers on the right that progress could be made in bringing Aboriginal people in from the cold, rather than old colonial enemies who, along with the hated dingoes and kangaroos, had speared cattle and remained camped around homesteads. Perhaps the stalwarts of the old country party could begin to perceive Aborigines as neighbours and friends, facing the same challenges as the white pastoralists and white townsfolk in remote and regional Australia. Perhaps, he wondered, they could be persuaded to think rationally about the large and exponentially increasing Aboriginal populations that lived next door to them, as human beings with whom they shared the fate of living in regional Australia with all of its blessings and hardships. Spoken and written, his lectures and think pieces changed the way that people think about Aboriginal people and their future in the nation. In recent months, I have caught glimpses of the profound change that this national conversation instigated. A change in white attitudes is evident, and moreover, a change in the way that Aboriginal people contend with racism has changed. Howard haters in particular have accused Noel of informing the Howard agenda. This is true, but for 12 long years, while they wrung their hands and sniped at Noel, the Aboriginal world has been divided into even starker camps of the extremely disadvantaged and less disadvantaged. Noel Pearson developed a comprehensive response through a number of organisations, and most recently, the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership. The approach to policy is evidence-based, and it builds on good development economics. It proposes using policy levers that have worked elsewhere, but its work involves research and consultation so that proposed policy responses are based in community aspirations. With a radical right government in power from 1996 under the leadership of the Right Honourable John Howard, it was the acceptance of some of Noel's key ideas by the Liberal Party members to whom he spoke that enabled a change in policy. There were many Australians inimical to the Australian Labor Party vision and policies, and especially the Right Honourable Paul Keating's so-called big picture. But these Liberal Party members, nevertheless, eschewed old frontier racism of the kind that Howard and his acolytes, Geoffrey Blaney, Christopher Pearson, Andrew Bolt and others, spewed into the national debate. Noel Pearson's conversation with the nation presaged the focus on child neglect, abuse and suicide that is now thankfully part of the policy debate. He brought the frontier white men into the discussion and enabled the proposition for a bipartisan approach. It is up to Brendan Nelson now to take up the challenge. He should not engage in schoolyard brawls in Parliament while Aboriginal issues are at stake. By doing so, he is endangering the one great opportunity that we have for bipartisanship and cooperative federalism to become the underlying principles in how we tackle these problems. We are all responsible for bringing to an end the fruitless arguments about left versus right. No one camp has all the answers, and no one camp has the moral high ground. It is also time for undergraduate politics of the left to end. The lives of children are at stake, this generation and several more to come. Aboriginal families need houses to live in. Therefore, secure titles such as long-term leases are required for housing projects. Children need to grow into satisfying livelihoods and careers. Only some of them will be able to choose the life of a part-time hunter-gatherer. The majority will need to be educated, skilled and capable of working in the workforce. Therefore, they must attend school regularly. In that case, their domestic lives must be such that they are able to attend school every day. clean and well-fed and able to do homework. If they face violence, sleepless nights, empty cupboards and extreme poverty, they will have lives such as those described by the coroner in his report on the 22 suicides at Fitzroy Crossing, one of which included an 11-year-old boy. I reject the false libertarianism of the left, applied to our family and community circumstances, but not to their own. We are faced with the unprecedented opportunities to close the gaps in the overwhelming levels of disadvantage suffered by Aboriginal people in life expectancy, educational attainment, employment, housing and economic development. The Prime Minister has acknowledged the burden of history that makes the efforts of so many people to change these circumstances particularly difficult. The impact of the apology delivered by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition on behalf of the Parliament of Australia on the 13th of February is incalculable in this regard. It is possible now for a more sophisticated approach to these problems than in the last decade. The Australian Labor Party is in power in all states and territories and at the federal level. Hence, the Prime Minister Rudd's call for cooperative federalism, announced on the 13th of February, offers the greatest strategic opportunity for several changes to how business is done in Indigenous affairs. It will be possible to hold governments accountable for the large financial transfers to the state and territory governments and local governments intended to be spent on overcoming disadvantage among Indigenous populations. It will be possible to obtain the cooperation of the relevant agencies in the states and territory governments to implement national approaches in health, education, employment and economic development. It will be possible to monitor the progress made among Indigenous populations with a national approach to monitoring and evaluating programs. For too long, the Indigenous populations have been held to ransom in an ugly state-federal war over finances, and the race card has been played in order for the protagonists to shift blame for their dereliction of duty and use funds aimed at overcoming disadvantage for other purposes. It is critical that strong women and men join the debate and tell the truth. I have been refusing more and more lately to attend meetings with bullies. This is a personal preference, but our work would be so much easier if we could insist on enlightened standards of behaviour in our work and demand evidence of outcomes and progress. So let me end by congratulating all those who worked diligently to bring the Families Responsibilities Commission Bill before the Queensland Parliament. This is a sure sign of change and of the need for genuine reform. Thank you for listening to me.
So now we'd like to open for question time, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions for Marcia. So what we're doing is we've actually got microphones on either side, and we'll have two people coming down. So if you could put your hands up, and I'll nominate who goes first, and they will bring the microphone to you. So the lady in the middle, first of all.
Hello, Marcia. My name's Justine. We actually spoke on the phone recently. I wanted to follow on from what you were saying about policy levers, Noel Pearson's concept of policy levers, and how they interact with, say, Parliament in Canberra. Is it possible to expand on that?
Well, as you know, there's been a debate about whether or not quarantining welfare payments so that some proportion of social security payments can only be spent on food and essential household items in designated places. In other words, social security, there's a proportion of the social security payments that cannot be spent in alcohol outlets. And whether or not this is an abuse of human rights. Well, it might be in the implementation, but in principle it is not. Many countries in the world have no social security system whatsoever. And say in the United States of America, the food stamp was used for many years as a way to avoid the kinds of problems that we're now tackling in Australia. And there's a worldwide debate about welfare dependency and the policy levers that can be used to avoid a growing welfare-dependent part of the population, especially amongst at-risk populations. It's also a problem because many countries will not be able to afford present-day social security benefit national bills, say, in 20 years' time or even sooner. So there's a debate around the world about how you shift people off social security dependency or welfare dependency, and there are a number of incentives and disincentives that are used to do so, and these are called policy levers. So you have the rather brutal and crude version of that policy lever in the present social security quarantining in the Northern Territory. There are other ways to do it and achieve the same effect. All of them involve quarantining welfare payments so that some significant proportion of the household income is spent on food and essential household items such as rent and electricity and so on. Now, apparently I'm hearing from my contacts in the Northern Territory that the evidence is coming in that welfare quarantining is beginning to work to achieve some of its goals. One of them is tying continuing social security income to school attendance where there are children in the house. And so apparently school attendance has improved. Another of the outcomes is increasing the amount of food available in social security dependent households. And it seems that the income in Aboriginal community stores where welfare quarantining has been implemented has increased dramatically. So that's just to mention two of the outcomes. In Cape York, there are 4 trial communities which have volunteered to trial welfare quarantining, but to do so in a much more focused way on families that are not coping well, and to do so with a range of other programs in place, and for instance, one of them has been in place for quite some time, and that is family income management. The Family Income Management Scheme, which shows people how to budget and plan. Another is, of course, another leg of the policy table, if you like, is ensuring that parents and grandparents and carers have a relationship with the school and understand why children need to go to school. It's not so easy, of course, to make schools work. That's another debate altogether. But another is also alcohol management plans. Now, there are problems, of course. Not everything about alcohol management plans work, especially when you're up against grog runners, people who ship grog into communities in the dead of night in the truckload or the plane load. And, of course, you can't have enough police to police grog runners. And it's also a very dangerous task, taking on grog runners. But nevertheless, you need to stop the rivers of grog flowing into Aboriginal communities. And so you need a broad range of policies. Now, it's very clear that these policy levers, which were set out in from a hand out to a hand up proposal of the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership, was cherry-picked by the Howard government. And they took parts of it, but not all of it, and implemented it in a military fashion in the Northern Territory. Now, it's unfortunate that the Aboriginal communities have not been able to participate in developing their own programs and developing ways to implement programs to bring them out of poverty. And, you lose time and you lose community support. People feel disheartened and less willing to become involved in this kind of work. And we see that pattern over and over again. So that is why community involvement is so important. And of course, a stranger, such as one of the business managers under the Northern Territory legislation brought into a community, doesn't know people, is an outsider. He'll never know family secrets. He'll never know, how people are related to each other, who's in which clan, what are the alliances across and between communities. And so he or she is immediately at a disadvantage in working in these communities. And the failure to work with community members is, I think, a very significant shortfall or flaw in the Northern Territory emergency intervention. But in any case, that's what I call policy levers. But of course, you can have a big policy lever like quarantining the welfare or social security payments, but none of that will work unless you have more refined policy levers at the local and regional level.
If you wouldn't mind, because we're recording this, if you wouldn't mind just saying your name and if there is an organisation, that'd be great. Thanks.
Wanya Marcia in my language, Barry Maliza, brother to Les, who people are hearing a lot from these days. There's 3 points I'd like to bring up from your discussion. The first one on that is Big Bunga. Many Murrays across Queensland would refer Noel Pearson in that category as you've described it. The second one is that the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which was passed in December last year, is also saying that Indigenous people in this country have rights far above normal citizenship, and that's something that the government presently doesn't recognise. Excuse me, I'm on the verge of a bit of a flu. The third issue is I don't see any government policy at any welfare level that needs to eliminate the Racial Discrimination Act can be considered fair and just. If the policies that are being enacted in the Northern Territory and proposed for Queensland are fair and just, then they should be applicable for all citizens in these states in this country.
That's a lot to address. And I didn't take notes. So, all right, first of all, I don't agree that Noel's in the category of big bunga politicians. I've worked with him a lot. Sure, we have our screaming matches over points of philosophy and political science, but we remain friends after 20 years. But I don't think any of us are without fault, especially in the Aboriginal world, in relation to intimidation and bullying. But, there are some people whose purported leadership is based on nothing more than intimidation and bullying. Well, that's not the case with Noel. I first started working with Noel back in 1989, and I actually went to work as for the Cape York Land Council when it was one small office in Cairns in 1993. And Noel and I worked on land claims, native title claims, setting up the Cape York Land Council, setting up the Upper Nipama Health Council. And wherever Noel goes in Cape York, he consults with people, he talks with them, he goes to a great deal of effort to explain propositions to them so that they understand. And, that kind of hard work in the communities pays off. That is why there are 4 communities in Cape York that have volunteered for the alcohol management plans and volunteered for the welfare reform program. And there aren't many people in Australia doing that kind of work. Another one is Galarrwuy Yunupingu, who's here in the photograph with me and Noel and the young lawyer for the Gumatj Association, Sean Bowden, on your far left. Galarrwuy is likewise tackling the alcohol problem in northeast Arnhem Land. Now, I can remember back in 1991 when I worked here for a government department, raising the issues of alcohol. Well, I was pilloried by the Aboriginal men in this town. You can't take away our human right to drink alcohol. And I was intimidated and I was threatened and there were death threats at home and so on. And you can tell your mates, I don't forget and I don't forgive. So, it's been a long battle for a very many years to get people to understand the scourge of alcohol abuse in Aboriginal communities. And now the scourge of drug abuse. Now, I simply don't accept. And, you would have to find me a library of books supporting the contention that pulling the kind of policy levers that we're talking about is either racist or an abuse of human rights, because I've done my homework. All kinds of policy levers are pulled, and there are all kinds of categories of people who are identified in legislation. So you have your old age pensioner, you have your single supporting parent, you have your disabled person. These are categories of people, and policy levers are pulled to address their particular needs. Now, the fact of the matter is that there are particular needs historically determined in remote area and regional Australian Aboriginal communities where there are very large proportions of people who are welfare dependent and where some levers need to be pulled to get people out of intergenerational welfare dependency and into the workforce. It's not racist, it's a simple policy lever for an identified need. That they happen to be identified elsewhere by the false notion of race is not relevant to this argument. Now, unfortunately, the people who've proposed these policy levers are not very good at explaining these things simply because, and I'll take Mal Brough, whom I have a great deal of admiration for. He served in Vietnam. He lives up the back of Caboolture somewhere. He's not very good at explaining these issues because, by and large, Australians don't really understand the swamp of racism that they live in, and they find it difficult to disaggregate these issues. Saying about an old age pensioner that they need a healthcare card or a tram discount is not being ageist, it's simply identifying a need. And this is my point about development economics. We need good development economics. We need to disaggregate these problems and we need to address them as types of socio-economic need and pull the right levers. It's not racist. That people are from a particular race, and presumably others. I mean, look at my skin colour. You can call me Aboriginal or you can call me something else. Sometimes I feel like applying to China for asylum, but anyway, it's not racist. Now, the Racial Discrimination Act. The Racial Discrimination Act is a very tricky piece of legislation. Yes, it makes racist acts by governments illegal. It does a number of other things as well. But it's very difficult to prove racism, especially when there is no stated intention that something is, implemented for a race. The problem is our horrible constitution. And this is why Galarrwuy is saying over and over again we need constitutional reform. We need to change the constitution and take the racism out of the constitution. And this is why we need to involve Aboriginal people in real development economics and not the, frankly, nutcase theories that have come out of the 19th century and the 1950s that perpetually, on the left and on the right, classify us as a race. The problem isn't about race, the problem is about needs, actual needs. And we need to identify them, we need to get the policy levers right. I would prefer, like in South Africa, where a very interesting term is used, nobody uses the word black in talking about these issues. Why? Because it's racist. Because it's a racialist category. They use a very interesting category. It's historically disadvantaged persons. Now, of course, 90% of the South African population are historically disadvantaged persons. But it takes the racism out of the concept. And that's what we should do here. So that answers part of your question, and I'm not sure that I got to everything there, but I did my best. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. And lady down the front here.
Camilla Cowley, formerly Southwest Queensland, Goongerrie country. I suppose since the Northern Territory intervention was implemented, I'm sure there's a lot of non-Indigenous Australians who have been in my position, where we don't really know what to think. In my case, we have children up in Katherine who are seeing the worst results of unmanaged alcohol, violence, all that sort of thing. And we don't know who to ask. We don't know whether Melbrough did consult with communities. We don't know how it's possible to consult with communities where you tell us that historically there have been powerful families who have controlled everything, and how do you consult with those in the next tier? How are the voices heard? For me, all I can do is talk to the Goongerrie elders that I know so well, because they're the only Indigenous people that our family built a strong relationship with. And I know what they tell me is they can't have a voice because they were never stolen. They were gathered up on reserves, but it's a different situation. Unless you have lived or are living on these remote Aboriginal communities, Auntie Ethel tells me, you really can't have a voice. So that leaves people like me not really understanding what is good, what is bad, and just feeling for the women and the kids and not knowing what to do or think about it.
Thank you. Look, you've hit the nail on the head. I suspect, and I've heard him intimate as much, that Melbrough took a view that I would sometimes agree with, not in all circumstances, but I think this was his view. It's better to act on a population-wide basis and prevent crimes from being committed, crimes against children, than to consult forever and perhaps get nowhere. Now, you know, there is an ideology of consultation that's developed in the last 30 years in the mode of what I call big bunga politics, and it goes something like this. You can't do that because you haven't consulted my community, right? So you can't prevent a crime from being committed. You can't put in place a program to ensure that children go to school. You can't build a women's shelter to prevent domestic violence. You can't deliver essential services because Big Bunga hasn't been consulted. So yeah, there's a, very slippery element of politics involved in all of that. And a lot of naive people go into the Aboriginal world thinking, I want to help the Aborigines. Well, they don't stand a chance in Hades of helping Aborigines because they don't have a clue. You see, it's very difficult to convey to rich white Australians who read a daily newspaper fare of, misrepresentation of Aborigines, that, first of all, being an Aboriginal person is very complicated. We're not the cardboard cutouts that newspapers and television programs would depict us as. Secondly, poverty is very complicated. Poverty is relative. You can be dirt poor, but, pretty happy. It depends on whether or not you have a range of things that make for a good life. If you have a school and the school does a good job, tick. If you have a house with a roof over your head, you don't get wet when it rains and you don't freeze when it's cold, you don't cook when it's hot, tick. So, there's a range of essential elements of the good life. You can be terribly, terribly poor and, in financial terms and You still have a good life. But you can have a lot of money and live in a remote area Aboriginal community and have none of those things, and it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you'll have a miserable life. So poverty is relative and poverty is complicated, and poor people are just as intelligent as you or me. Not only that, they're very good at getting around systems, because if you're hungry, you will figure out how to get around any system thrown up in your face. So, for instance, not long after welfare quarantining was implemented in Alice Springs, the drunks were out selling the food cards and the alcohol cards for $150 to taxi drivers. So you can have the best system in the world, but poor people and, moreover, alcoholics and drug addicts will always find a way around the system. If you've ever lived with a drug addict, you'll know what I'm talking about. So, you know, the whole business of working in Aboriginal Australia has been depicted as a bit of a mugs game. And, you know, you don't need many qualifications and you can be recycled out of a local government somewhere and dropped into hell and expected to perform with a budget, a complicated legislative arrangement, a desperate population, lack of services, the electricity goes off, the phones don't work, need I go on? And is it any surprise that people don't last long? All of these positions are revolving doors. That's why I think Malbrough put in these business manager positions, into the legislation. I mean, I don't know. I didn't ever get to ask him, but I'm just double guessing what he was up to. Now, as I said, I don't think that's going to work. And already I've seen some of these business managers go in, go out. Not only that, they went in, they built themselves a house, nobody else has got a house, you know. These are not sustainable propositions. We need to adopt measures from the developing world where aid agencies are to some extent regulated and their performances measured, and where they have, you know, developed strategic planning, business planning, accountability. We need all of those in the business of Indigenous affairs. For too long, it's been a bit like a socialite's ball, right? And there have been not enough rules. Now, I know that people say, oh yes, but the government departments audit us to within an inch of our lives, and we have to account for every stand. But that's not what I'm talking about. Penny ante auditing of the kind that is inflicted on Aboriginal NGOs is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real strategic planning with inputs and outputs, measurable outcomes, not whether or not every stamp was accounted for. So we need to be much more sophisticated, that's my argument. Now, that means that, you have to be pretty sophisticated about whether or not you should consult, what you should consult about and whom you should consult. And that means having some knowledge. And I would prefer that the whole business of consultation were professionalised and given to people who are professional and, experts in their field. I heard a wonderful talk by a South African. As it happened, he was a non-historically disadvantaged South African, and he had, worked his way out of his job, and an historically disadvantaged South African had taken over a very good job in the corporate world, so he'd become a consultant. And he started to explain to people what goes wrong in community development in South Africa. And he drew a diagram of consultation from the most naive forms of consultation to the most sophisticated. And at the bottom of the pyramid is the question, what do you want? And so he gave stories of people going into, communities and asking people, what do you want? Well, somebody had been bitten by a dog the day before, so they want a fence. They didn't mention that the fridge hasn't worked for 2 years. And so, there's a hierarchy of ways of approaching consultation, but the most sophisticated approaches fit in with strategic planning and area planning or municipal planning. So, that I might want a new fence is completely irrelevant to the municipal plan, because fences are 3 years down the track. We're going to get the electricity system working first, for instance. So, and it is also true that the people who live in these blighted communities have no voice. And that's another of the points that I made in my talk. They have no voice, nobody wants to talk to them, and a lot of people assume that they're stupid and they don't have anything to say and they don't understand their own situation. Well, that's just plain wrong. And, you know, that is actually the point of what I'm saying.
We are running out of time and we've probably got time for one more question. So down here at the front, Catherine. Thank you.
You said that the Aboriginal children, I'm Romany Rogers, no organisation. You said the Aboriginal children of the future will not be able to live a hunter-gatherer society for the most and need to start attending school. I'm just wondering on a practical level, what elements of Aboriginal culture are you seeing as being able to be maintained? Is the Nugget Coombs vision completely dead or relevant? Is the assimilationist vision completely dead or relevant?
I didn't say that children won't be able to live the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. I said there are, it's actually a small proportion of our entire Aboriginal population who will be able to continue to live the part-time hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And, obviously they live in parts of Cape York, Arnhem Land, and in the Western Desert. And obviously around Utopia, where there's very encouraging health data being reported. Places like that. So, look, let me just say that when he was alive, Nugget Coombs was a great friend of mine, and I'm sickened by the misrepresentation of his work. And the people who vilified him deserve a very special place in hell, because he was a good man. Now, they've depicted him as a complete idiot. They'd failed to tell you that he was the key public servant in the post-war reconstruction of Australia, that he advised 8 prime ministers, that he was the governor of the Reserve Bank. It was Nugget Coombs who set up the Australia Council, Opera Australia, and many of the institutions that people just now take for granted. And the idiots plural, who wrote that nonsense about Nugget Coombs have never opened an Australian history book, and I will warrant that they've never opened a book by Nugget Coombs himself. Now, most of the things they've attributed to him are just plain wrong. I reckon that the detractors of Nugget Coombs got drunk at a bar with a journalist and a few people who, you might have heard them on radio last night. Well, I used to work with the Full Bloods, and I can tell you, look, Nugget Coombs has been adopted into an Aboriginal clan and family. He spent a lot of time working with Aboriginal people after he retired. He's a very good economist. He developed solutions that were fantastic for the time. But the problem was that the people who followed him were not educated at the London School of Economics. In fact, I dare to say that they were probably high school dropouts. And so thereafter we had this Philistine approach to Aboriginal affairs, You think that, you're the sole inheritor of the she'll be right, mate attitude? No, we cop it all the time. So, why do we have basically what is an Aboriginal training scheme, which is far more discriminatory than welfare quarantining, the Community Development Employment Program? 25 years after it was invented. because nobody came up with a better idea. Now, I'm not a Labor economist, but there's a job to be done. It's urgent. But after Nugget's work, we sort of spiralled into this experimental, specialist set of policies that, aren't based on evidence, aren't based in good economic theory, aren't based in good development economics. They were invented at a bar, mate. Somebody got drunk one night. So I just heard a bit too much stuff about the late Nugget Coombs. I simply had to say that to the point where I've now forgotten what the point of your question was.
What elements of Aboriginal culture do you see as being able to be maintained?
Well, culture is a big, complicated, mostly subconscious set of behaviours and beliefs and the way that people do things. And what continues and what doesn't is completely unpredictable. Completely and absolutely unpredictable. You can take a wild guess and you might be right. But, what has survived? Well, look, only a proportion of the many, many hundreds of Aboriginal languages have survived. Well, that's because of, children being removed, desperate family circumstances, the removal of entire populations and so on. So, we've suffered badly in terms of language loss, and Australia actually has the highest rate of language loss in the world because of what's happening to Aboriginal languages. Kinship systems have actually fared well and remain strong in many parts of Australia. But on the other hand, we have very large populations of Creole speakers. So Aboriginal society is very inventive. Aboriginal traditions are always being regenerated. So you see, old traditions becoming revived and adapted. And indeed, it's not as if Aboriginal people sort of suddenly left the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and moved into a 3-bedroom house. There were, people were working with the white settlers from day one of contact, that is. And people have been involved in the Australian economy in all sorts of extraordinary ways. So, and 200 years is a long time. So, and there's been a lot of population change. The Aboriginal population was dramatically affected by the frontier, and it was much reduced by the early 20th century, and then in the late 20th century it started to increase. So I can't answer that question, but there are very dynamic Aboriginal cultures still alive around Australia. And there are also lots of cultural traditions that survive in families. And certainly they're a bit more than, the annual wearing of the kilt and playing the bagpipes. But, why is the kilt so popular? Good question, isn't it? Some things just, catch on, and there's no answer,
Well, I'm sure there's many more questions, but unfortunately our time is up, and I'm sure Marcia's running out of breath up here speaking to us. So before we thank Marcia formally, I'd just like to particularly thank Griffith Review for bringing to us the level of such debate and bringing it here to the State Library. It's exhilarating and exciting and informing for all of us. So thank you. And one of the things I'd like to say is we'll actually the essays are available for sale here tonight. So if you want to pick up your copy, but more than that, I really highly recommend that you subscribe to it. I'd also like to say too that we here at the State Library are very proud to bring quite a lot of these lovely discussions to you. So if you're interested, there are some flyers on further panels that will be held here, and please come along, we'd love to see you. And one last thing, sorry to keep you there, Marcia, is that we've got a special thing because we'd love you to fill out your feedback forms for us tonight, and they're just outside. Is that right, Catherine? And if you could this is a little twist on dropping the business card in the fishbowl, but if you would drop your it's filling out drop a business card or fill out a evaluation form for us outside, and you will be in with a chance to win the next edition of the Griffith Review, which is great, and as well a $50 voucher from the State Library bookshop. So if that's not an incentive, nothing is. But what I really want to do is thank Marcia so much for tonight. It's just been extraordinary, and I will walk away from here thinking so deeply about tonight. So will you join with me in thanking Marcia?